It always does this. Okay, here we go. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, peace be unto you. It is really an honor that people sort of trust in the work that we've done with the Black Muslim COVID Coalition and the conversations that we've had over the last 9 months. My name is Dr. Camilla Mukmin Rashad. I'm the president and founder of Muslim Wellness Foundation, and also the founding co-director of the Black Muslim COVID Coalition. My background is in psychology. I'm a psychologist, and my areas of expertise include sort of identity, religion, race, healing, and trauma. And so with sort of that background, it's really important for us to, as we face the current context that we're in, that we also understand that there's always sort of an emotional response. There's sort of the psychological impact of just the time that we're living in. We have sort of personal and professional obligations. And then we're faced with, this decision around vaccination, whether to avoid it, what does it mean? And so we've always felt, just in these last 9 months and the work that we've done with the coalition, to bring together experts, those that we trust in the community to give us accurate information, and also who have an understanding, a lived experience in the context that we're in, to be able to offer not just their expertise, but also sort of the sincerity and the dedication and authenticity to say, we are also of the community. And so we're very much embedded in, these conversations around what does it mean for us to be, part of Black communities, Black Muslim communities, and to be wrestling with, very real and also existential questions about death, about mortality, about racism and systemic discrimination, which has contributed to the disproportionate impact in a variety of different ways on our community. And so this particular webinar is going to be focused on reconciling some of the fears that we have, which are legitimate, and also understanding, this rock and a hard place, for lack of a better term, that we find ourselves in this moment. And so I'll introduce you to the folks who will be offering their recommendations and expert advice here tonight. So this is me, Camilla Rashad. Dr. Safia Shabazz is a board certified family physician. She's the owner and medical director of Fountain Medical Associates, and here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We will also be joined later by Marguerite Hill, but she's sort of my late night for those who are up at 1 a.m. Shout out to the night owls. I was like, wait, there is someone who actually specializes in understanding the history of medicine and racial violence. And so Aya Nuruddin is a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University in the Department of the History of Medicine. So thank you for being gracious enough to lend your time at such short notice. Marguerite Hill is an anti-racist educator. She is the executive director of Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. She will be joining us shortly, and she is also the founding co-director of the coalition. So I'm going to move right in. Again, like I said, I want to make time to provide this overview, and then we can also move into the questions I'm sure that people have, some of the reflections that are sitting with you that I'm sure you would love to share. So again, the objectives, I'm sort of a teacher by nature, so forgive me if it feels like you've just entered into a classroom, but I think because we're all kind of zoomed out, right? I want to kind of set the expectations at the beginning, what we will cover, and then how we proceed from there. So Understanding the Psychology of Pandemics, there's a really great book by an author named Steven Tyler that is called The Psychology of Pandemics, that the last pandemic that we faced of this scale was about 100 years ago, the influenza, or quote unquote Spanish flu. And so there's a lot of information that we've been able to gather over the last century that can inform what we can expect. Some of the responses to this time are actually not unexpected. And we also want to acknowledge the Black trauma, right, stemming from health disparities and medical racism. Dr. Sophia will walk us through the science of the COVID vaccine. What do we need to know? And again, I'll offer a disclaimer that this does not in any way is a substitute for consultation with a physician or a healthcare professional, but we can offer guidance for you to begin to have that conversation. And then next steps and recommendations. Okay. So, you know, I thought it was really a profound moment to have the first person in the United States to have the vaccine is a Black woman, right? And given the history of, you know, the ways in which Black women have been treated by medical professionals going back again centuries, for the first individual in this country to receive the vaccine to be an African-American woman who is an intensive care nurse. Her name is Sandra Lindsay. And I thought her words were, and her commitment to demonstrating this very publicly, that she would take the vaccine, I thought was very profound. She said, "I feel like healing is coming. I hope this marks the beginning of the end of a very painful time in history. I want to instill public confidence that the vaccine is safe. We are in a pandemic, and so we all need to do our part. There's light at the end of the tunnel." And so this was just Monday, right? And so we're moving through a week in which we see, you know, many other healthcare professionals sort of follow her lead and have the vaccine sort of taken, you know, in the news, on air. But that was met with some skepticism, right? Given, again, the history. So again, just providing some of the context, and the context important so that when we have this conversation together, you know, we can sort of use some of the same language. We have a frame of reference, and I think that's very important. So again, I don't want you to hold your questions. If you have one, definitely go to the Q&A function or submit it through chat, and then we'll follow up. So this is probably the most sobering of the context in which we find ourselves, that as of December 8th, right? So this number might be higher. About 50,000 Black Americans have died of COVID-19. I don't know about you, but just the numbers, there's a way in which it's hard. It kind of boggles the mind to understand the enormity of the impact of this death and devastation, that, you know, if we were to sort of be sort of in the same room or virtual room, I'm sure that we all, many, if not all of us, know someone who has died of COVID, who's had COVID and recovered, but are still experiencing symptoms of the coronavirus. That we know that is impacted the community in really harsh and devastating ways, economically, physically, psychologically. And so when we talk about the numbers, I want us to also bring to mind those that we might have lost, the ways that it has completely, right, and permanently in some ways changed our lives as we know it. So that is part of the context that I want us to bear in mind. Another sobering, just as an example, in the state of Georgia, 1 in about 21 people have contracted COVID-19, right? And so, you know, Atlanta is not Georgia, but when we think about just 1 in 20 people, right? And so if you think about your own social circle, right, perhaps not just the voluntary bubble that you're in, but those who are connected to those that you have chosen to kind of distance with, your social circle is actually quite large. So if you think about 1 in 20, right, that may include folks that you know, again, who have contracted the virus, who have recovered, or unfortunately have died. Aya Noordine is going to talk a bit more about the Tuskegee experiment. Again, as part of our context, right? Why is this such a difficult decision for us to make as Black Americans? It's been hotly debated, as I'm sure you know, and maybe you've been a part of those conversations on social media. But this is just one example of why this is a conversation that we need to have very thoughtfully and very openly. The Tuskegee experiment, and again, Professor Noureddin will expand on this, the history of medicine. There have been, sort of a curious sort of focus on the Black American response. We're between 12 and 14% of the population, but a lot of the news coverage has been on like, why aren't Black Americans accepting of the vaccine, right? Feels a little bit like gaslighting to me, because there is a very clear history as to why we are rightfully skeptical. So this survey done by the Kaiser Family Foundation said 35% of Black Americans said that they will not take the vaccine. This may change from day to day, right? Depending on the information people have access to. But again, a significant majority of people either have already decided that they will not, or they're still on the fence. We have to talk about conspiracy theories. I love my people, but we have a lot of thoughts. And so if you can remember, right, back 9 months, there was even sort of disbelief about whether or not Black Americans could get COVID. I think that it was perhaps, I think Idris Elba publicly stated that he had COVID, and people were like, oh, okay, maybe Black people can get the Rona. And so some of these conspiracy theories have persisted. And again, this is not just specific to the COVID-19 pandemic. This was also the case 100 years ago during the influenza pandemic. There were a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of sort of myths circulating. And the reason that these conspiracy theories, or these sort of speculation about the virus takes root, is because there's so much uncertainty. So it is not surprising that people are sort of wondering, is this real, right? We may see the impact, but is it real? Where does it come from? There's a lot of fear and uncertainty. And so it's understandable, given those conditions, that people are wary, they're skeptical. There are even those who still perhaps believe that it's a hoax, or that, it's caused by 5G. But this is very real. And I would say perhaps you're still holding on to, that disbelief. But what is a fact, and that hasn't been, or is not made up, is that we've lost 50,000 Black Americans, right? 314,000 Americans have died. Over 17 million have been infected, right? These aren't things that are made up. And so whether or not there's some debate about the source of the virus, the very impact of it is real and undeniable. This, I think, is worth mentioning. If people are following, or maybe have heard some rumblings about this, on December 21st, there is, rightfully some humor. Some people do believe that December 21st will be the day that Black American superpowers will be unlocked, right? So we should not, and this was about December 5th. I think this tweet happened, or went out publicly. And so why do people, right, invest in or believe in this conspiracy theories? Again, fear, uncertainty. There's a lot that's unknown that people are learning still every day about the virus. So that's fertile ground for some of the theories. So this is sort of a summary of, what's called, the World Health Organization calls it vaccine hesitancy, right? It's the history of medical abuse, right? And Professor Noureddin will talk about the Tuskegee experiment and the history of medicine. It's systemic racism and health disparities, which leads to, for some, not even being able to access adequate healthcare, mistrust in healthcare professionals, right? COVID fatigue, right? We've been sort of hypervigilant and, trying to adhere to some of the precautions, but we're 9 months in, right? So we're at a stage where people are exhausted, right? And so might be just
either unwilling or kind of at capacity, emotionally, physically, to be able to even consider, right, something else related to the coronavirus. Just basic information is unavailable, or is overwhelming, or is confusing. And then there's, the misinformation, the conspiracy theories. For those who have, gotten an invite to Clubhouse, should I say more? There's a lot of information that's being disseminated that is not accurate. And so all of this sort of contributes. It's historical, it's in the present, it is the anti-Black racism, the white supremacy, the oppression, which has contributed to these disparities that we see today. And so there's legitimate skepticism about why should we believe that this vaccine will be a cure? Why should, I've heard a lot of people say like, well, I don't want to be a guinea pig, right? We've been tested on before. We don't know those, if there are even Black Americans in these trials. How do we know there's not going to be adverse side effects? So all of this contributes to this sense of wariness or skepticism or mistrust. And so what I really want folks to take away is that if you are feeling concerned, if you are feeling a sense of doubt and concern, it is in fact legitimate, and that should be acknowledged. So I always try to build in these pauses, these deep breaths for myself, for all of us who are in this conversation, that we should take a deep breath, right? These may bring up years and decades and centuries, right? Even just images of the Tuskegee experiment, mentioning the name of it may bring up a lot of feelings and thoughts. And so we should honor what we're feeling and what's coming up for us and take a deep breath, right? And then take another, and we'll continue. So I want to turn it over to Professor Noureddin to talk about the understanding the history of medicine and how it's related to some of the concerns and the fears that folks have.
Thanks so much. I'm really glad to see all of you here. What I want to start with and really spend time discussing with all of you today is that we often think about Tuskegee as this particular or very singular moment of exploitation, of medical racism, of violence. But the US and many countries throughout the world have a much longer, broader, and much more varied history of medical racism, particularly in the forms of human subjects research and human experimentation. And a lot of that history is part of beliefs of scientific racism that emerge as early as the 17th century, these beliefs that racial groups have inherent biological differences, beliefs that somehow Black people's bodies are fundamentally biologically different than white people's bodies, than Asian people's bodies, et cetera. And a lot of that undergirds and shapes a lot of the health inequalities that we're still seeing today, even though this has been scientifically disproven time and time again, that there are not fundamental biological differences between racial groups, but these ideas persist and have a lot of historical roots that shape the kinds of historical material that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. There's numerous historical examples that we can look to that demonstrate how medical and scientific practice were connected with bigger structures of racism, of discrimination, and of violence. Some of us might be familiar with the histories of medical experimentation during slavery. One of the key examples of this is with the gynecologist named James Marion Sims, who did experimentations on 3 enslaved women named Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, among other women. Those are the women that we know their names have survived in the historical record. But Sims experimented on these women over the course of a number of years to develop a technique to repair vesicovaginal fistula, which is a complication of natural childbirth. And so these women were experimented on without anesthetic for him to develop this technique. And one of the reasons he experimented on enslaved women was he believed that white women could not withstand the procedure. So he tested it out on Black women because they were believed to be stronger and more hardy. because of these prevailing ideas of scientific racism that existed in the 19th century. There's also stories, and I think some of us may have heard inklings of these kinds of rumors growing up, but that enslaved people's bodies, and even after slavery, people's bodies were stolen from graveyards and cemeteries and used for anatomical dissections in medical schools. And this is a practice that persisted well into the 20th century. A number of Southern medical institutions actually would hire or purchase enslaved African Americans for the express purpose of acquiring other Black people's bodies to use for anatomical dissection in medical schools. And this, I think many of us have heard rumors of grave robbing and getting snatched and body snatching and these ideas that persist, but this is actually based in a very real practice that continues well into the middle of the 19th century, despite regulations that were supposed to regulate that practice. And so medical experimentation and exploitation that goes along with it has historically targeted populations that have been vulnerable. So this not only includes Black people in many settings, but also includes people who are incarcerated. It includes people with disabilities, psychiatric patients, children, et cetera. Because before we have the regulation of human subjects research and laws determining who can and cannot be experimented on, basically anyone who is at the mercy of the state could become eligible for lots of different kinds of research studies before we have ideas of consent and things like that. And so prisoners and particularly patients in mental hospitals or sort of long-term institutions for the disabled were often used as experimental subjects, often almost always without their consent. And so we have a major turning point in that history in the middle of the 20th century because of revelations of Nazi atrocities during World War II, which leads to the passage of something called the Nuremberg Code, which is the first thing historically we can look at as an example of laws set out to guide human subjects research practices, as well as protect the subjects that are being experimented on. Because prior to this law, subjects didn't really have any form of legal protection. And though the Nuremberg Code wasn't actually enforceable because it was a sort of international document, it still marks a really important turning point because we don't have regulations really before that, which leads to so many forms of experimentation and exploitation. But despite this turn, Black people continue to be disproportionately exploited as research subjects well after regulations exist. The 1950s and 60s are actually called by some historians the golden age of human experimentation because there's a tremendous increase in the number of studies that are taking place to test all kinds of drugs, to study different kinds of diseases. A lot of things that we might recognize now as useful are so like the polio vaccine is tested out in this period, which we know has a tremendous impact. Treatments for malaria are done on prisoners in the 1950s that become very useful for other forms of treatment later. Another really important example, because I'm affiliated with Johns Hopkins and has particular significance to me, is the story of Henrietta Lacks, who is a Black woman who lived in an area called Turner Station, who went to Hopkins for treatment for cervical cancer. At the time, Hopkins had segregated wards for Black patients that were charity wards, and they believed that because they were offering free or low-cost medical care, that gave them the right to experiment on patients without their knowledge or consent. And so Henrietta Lacks was one of many women who, and one of many people who had she was treated for cervical cancer, and during a procedure, her cells were taken without her knowledge and consent and became the basis of one of the first human cell lines in history. And again, this is done without her knowledge or her consent or her compensation. Her family has yet to receive any compensation from Johns Hopkins, even though Hopkins and many other institutions have made a tremendous amount of money off of the development of this human cell line known as the HeLa cells. And so Tuskegee, of course, is one of the most infamous examples, but I wanted to give give some of these other examples for context, because we sometimes treat Tuskegee as this lone moment, as if this is the one thing on the radar, as if it's not part of a much longer and sort of ongoing set of exploitation. So it's officially called the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. It begins in 1932 and runs until 1972. It's operated by the United States Public Health Service, which later becomes the CDC, and split. There's a lot that happens there, but and it's done with the support of a group called the Rosenwald Foundation, which is the philanthropic arm of what used to be the Sears department store. And it's also done in a lot of ways with cooperation of Black physicians and nurses who were at Tuskegee at the outset of the study. And so despite popular belief, I really want to make sure to hit home on this. The subjects in this study were not injected with syphilis. The study recruited patients who already were positive for syphilis and basically tracked their symptoms over time to see what would happen if they were not treated. That was it's an observational study. The whole point is just to see how bad syphilis gets if you don't do anything about it. And also to see if it looks different, if it manifests differently in Black people than it did in white people. It's based off of another longitudinal study that took place in Oslo years before its outset. And so I point this out because this contributes to some of these conversations we're hearing about vaccine hesitancy, that, oh, well, they injected Black people with syphilis, so why should we believe they're not injecting us with XYZ right now? But this study did not do that. It did other things that are also terrible, to be clear. The significant problem with this study is that there were treatments for syphilis that existed at the beginning of the study. So they were using things like mercury and bismuth to treat syphilis. There was also another treatment called malaria therapy, which is extremely problematic and disturbing. Basically, people with advanced tertiary neurosyphilis, so like really long gone syphilis, where it gets to the point where your brain begins to atrophy. So patients with really advanced syphilis would be given the malaria-infected blood of another patient to give the person malaria, because the fever induced by the malaria would kill the syphilis bacteria. And that was actually a treatment that was used a lot in mental institutions, because for a lot of the first half of the 20th century, a lot of people in mental hospitals were suffering from neurological complications of syphilis. And so the problem is even though treatment exists, treatment is withheld from the subjects of the Tuskegee study. And once penicillin becomes available in around 1946, 47, and penicillin is like an easy cure, right? And penicillin is still used, right, to treat syphilis among other infectious diseases. And it was still withheld from the subjects even after they knew it would cure them. And so the subjects were led to believe that they had something called bad blood, which was sometimes a euphemism for syphilis, but also it was also a generic term that could be used to describe lots of other things. So patients were never really clear of whether or not they had syphilis, but they were told they were being treated. They were given like iron supplements. Their blood pressure was taken. They got lumbar punctures. They got other kinds of medical care outside of being treated for syphilis as part of enrolling in the study. And what also happened as part of enrolling in the study is that when patients would, visit the various clinics for monitoring, they'd receive hot meals. And another thing that subjects received as part of their participation was a free burial, which was really significant because the subjects in places like Macon County, Georgia it was extremely rural, extremely poor. And so the free burial was an appealing prospect. What I will also point out though, is that there's another study that's happening simultaneously in Guatemala that's also run by the US Public Health Service, in which people are deliberately infected with diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. So it's important to just have clarity about what these sort of particular things are so that we're armed with knowledge and information. So after the Tuskegee study sort of goes public in 1972, even though there's an awareness in the medical community, but once the general public becomes more aware, of course, there's huge outcry, especially from Black people, because of how heinous this study was. And it leads to another wave of really significant regulations that continue to shape the ways that medical research is done even now. And so I'll just wrap up, since I could talk about this all day, which I think says a lot about what I do for a living. But I think what some of us will notice is that a lot of this sort of rumors and myths and some of the conspiracy theories, among other things that we've heard and have been passed on to us, come from a kind of distant knowledge of a lot of this medical exploitation that I'm talking about. And so even when people can't specifically name an experiment, a practice, or a specific moment, it's because people are skeptical because they have some awareness of this history. And I think that's really important to point out. I'll give one example that, again, being at Johns Hopkins, a lot of the Black people in the sort of immediate surrounding community of the hospital come to Johns Hopkins for treatment, and they will, for example, tell the residents and med students, like, well, I'm not going to do this. I don't want you experimenting on me. And I've heard people say things like, oh, I don't know why they always say that. That's so weird. These patients always think we're experimenting on them, and they think it's kind of a joke. And I always point out, like, it's not a joke, because not only do we know about Henrietta Lacks, but people are aware of this medical racism, and don't discount that, right? It is important for you to be aware that people have knowledge of medical racism, even if they don't have names, dates, and places, right? Like that this information exists in our sort of Black cultural memory of racism. And we need to be as aware of this history as possible. And I think, I'll wrap up here, but it's important to know this history, and knowing this history alongside other forms of reputable information from professionals can help us to make good decisions about things like the COVID vaccine, but other medical procedures as well, from a place of knowledge rather than a place of fear. And so I'll stop here.
Thank you for that, Professor Nuruddin. One of the sort of the things that I want to underscore about what you mentioned is that it is part of historical memory, and also contributes to intergenerational trauma. And so to kind of, again, contextualize this study and the long-lasting impact that it's had on the community, that the last study participant died in 2004. The last widow of a participant died in 2009, I believe. And so this isn't sort of some distant, obscure history that we are not directly connected to. And so for those who, especially with Johns Hopkins University, for those that are seeking medical treatment, this is something that is very real. And contributes to, a lot of the mistrust. And so it is not, again, I feel like it is a form of racial gaslighting to look at Black Americans as if we're just being irrationally paranoid, right? And because even before this study went public, I'm sure there were some rumblings, there was some concern, there were some questions that were being raised about this work. And so when we think about that, there are now also 11 children of those study participants that are receiving benefits, right, as a result of this going public, that there are folks that we can talk to, right, that can say, yes, my father was a part of this study. And so that has a very lasting and traumatic impact on our community that cannot be discounted. And I want to sort of reiterate again what you've expressed, that knowing the accurate historical sort of facts about the experimentation and the studies that were done, alongside, debunking some of these myths, so that we have accurate information. So accurate information is the reason that I wanted to sort of call on Dr. Sophia Shabazz to help explain, what do we need to know? Right? We have the historical memory, there's trauma that people have experienced that have been passed on. And so even that caution, right? Like don't let people stick you with anything. That caution persists. but we're able to mitigate some of those fears when we have information from trusted sources. So first, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so people can see Dr. Shabazz. And at first, I know you're going to tell us a little bit more about the vaccine, but I want you to share about your work, kind of being on the front lines, you know, these last 9 months of, you know, working with your patients who have been positive for COVID. So I want you to share a little bit about what your experience has been, and when folks come to you and they're very concerned and say, well, Dr. Sophia, what should I do? So if you could
Right.
share about that, that'd be great.
Well, I want to first go back, you know, to earlier in the year where, you know, my first real information about COVID was not from my own personal experience, but, you know, it was initially the thought like, okay, it's over there somewhere. It's, you know, not something that we'll probably need to be too worried about. But as it started to become very clear at the end of February, early March, that no, this is actually really a serious situation. And, you know, being privy to, you know, by participating in different, really, I guess they're like social media groups, but where they're for physicians, where, I mean, you really started to see an explosion of information and stories, mainly from the West Coast, about how much hell they were experiencing. Where I remember, you know, one post where someone said, you know, they were in Seattle and they're like, listen, if you have 2 weeks to prepare, do not get complacent. This is bad, 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 bad. Like, they had never seen anything like it. So, you know, that started to really get my anxiety level up to really try to understand as much as I could about the virus. And even though really we didn't start seeing, or I didn't start seeing cases in my practice until April. And then it was like all in 1 week where it started to come back to back. And then, you know, people say, well, if social distancing didn't work, you know, why are we still doing it? Or why are we going to do it again? Or like the lockdowns, the cases stopped in my practice, you know, like it did make a difference when people really adhered to, you know, separating themselves, staying, you know, with their household members. For the most part, it made a huge difference, where I didn't see a case in my practice for a couple of months. And then different colleagues in different areas of the country, you know, was similar, where it was, well, it depends on where you were, where it started to move from place to place. Like Middle America, you know, they don't believe in COVID. And so, you know, they experienced it at a later time because they were more isolated, and then got hit hard. What I can tell you in the last few weeks in my practice, I don't do hospital medicine. I'm not even in the hospital. But what I see is it's taken over my whole schedule. You know, people who have COVID symptoms, who have COVID infections, you know, where most of the people are getting, are testing positive after experiencing some symptoms. Here in Philadelphia, it's still not super easy to get tested. It's not like people are just getting tested willy-nilly. Right before Thanksgiving, it was especially hard because there were lots of people who didn't really have anything wrong with them, but maybe they wanted to hop on a plane, they wanted to visit family, they wanted to try to make this Thanksgiving thing work. And at least in this area, that didn't work out so well, because I mean, it's just been, we're really seeing the repercussions of that here in Philadelphia. I have never had to admit a patient or refer a patient to the hospital for flu, even though I know it happens. I know people get hospitalized with flu. I know people die with flu, but it just I never experienced that personally as a physician. I have had numerous patients who had to be admitted to the hospital. You know, things have gotten better in terms of the treatment. Thankfully, my patients have fared well. And I think I have some ideas about why, you know, whether something that I'm doing might be making a difference. But the fact is 98% or so of people do get better without doing anything. but then you could get really sick, and then lots of people, as you can see, do worse than that, and are deceased. And then there's a large number of people who they did not die, but they still are experiencing a lot of ongoing complications from the virus. So I think for all of these reasons, it really has created just a different lens, or a different, I call it a calculation. I was an engineer before I was a doctor. So it's like a different calculation that has to be done, because it's like, wait a minute, this is a lot of people who are falling very seriously ill, and a lot of people who are dying. And I said last May, I know people thought I was being my typical hyperbolic self, like, yeah, I think it's going to be 1 million people dead by this time next year. And now we're like, we're getting there. We're getting there. And, it didn't have to be this way, I don't think, but we're here now. So I guess that's just some background into what I'm saying. Now, people who work in the hospital, what I'm hearing from my medical colleagues is trauma. I think people are experiencing PTSD, like they can't do it anymore. Like this is something that they've never experienced before. And people get to their breaking point. Some people are at their breaking point. Some people may have been at their breaking point, at different times, like in New York, maybe they had a different breaking point, earlier on when they got really hit hard, and I'm sure seeing, sort of that coming back. But what I'm hearing from my colleagues is pain and suffering that they are experiencing, the trauma of seeing the death, the trauma of colleagues who may have gotten very seriously ill, some of whom didn't make it. That is traumatic for people. And I think that, it also leads to like this line between like how people who are dealing with that feel about the whole, vaccine or whatever other intervention you're going to do for COVID, and the people who are really not, like seeing as, one of my New York friends, she was like, yeah, it hit different when you're looking at somebody in the face gasping for air, and it's like, they're not gonna make it. Like what can you do? Like, they know they're very likely about to die, and you kind of know, like, yeah, it's probably not going to happen. So
I mean, I feel like there's so much more we can say about that, because for those who are, again, skeptical about the vaccine, I wonder, well, at least I want to challenge everyone to also think about the other people who are, right? Like you become a doctor and your oath is to save lives, right? Do no harm, save lives. Like you want people to be healthy. And when you're faced with this, this situation where, really all you can do is sort of make someone comfortable, right? As that they're approaching death. I wonder, and maybe we can talk about this in a Q&A, how it feels for someone, a doctor, healthcare professionals, nurses, for people to either deny that COVID is real, right? To refuse to social distance or wear masks, or to, say that they will be unwilling, right, to take the vaccine because they think this is a hoax. I wonder how, medical professionals are sort of also coping with those fears and concerns.
Right. I think people take it different ways. Like, I'm sure there's a lot, like early on, it was about the mask, where it was like, we don't have N95s. We have to come in here, like dealing with people who, like, they're actually in the mix, in the COVID milieu, and they didn't have the proper PPE, and they were directing their anger at people on the street who may have ordered their N95 from Amazon, and they were mad at them. And I'm like, I think your anger is misplaced, because you counted on your workplace to have your back and they did not. It's not their fault. You should have done what they did and had your own back, but you assumed that, your employer would have it. So I think some of that is going to happen and is happening.
Okay. So I want to pull back our slides just in sort of the next couple minutes. For those who are like, what is this vaccine? I'm being told to take it or not to take it, and I don't really know what it is. And so I'm hoping that you can, just for those who are kind of tuning in, what is this all about? What should we know? Hold on, I'm going to pull it right back up. Just sort of, and I know you're really great at this, sort of like breaking these down sort of in layman's terms, like what should we know about what this means?
Well, I mean, I'm not a vaccine expert, but I've spent a lot of time, reading and trying to learn as much as I can, in recent months, like everyone else. I think one thing that is important for everyone to know is that what the vaccines that are currently, recently received this emergency use authorization, they're both the same type here, this RNA vaccine, which is completely new in terms of being used in an actual product. A commercial vaccine that is not new. The technology isn't necessarily new, but this is the first time that it's getting to market. And these are the types we're talking about here, but there's other types of vaccines that are also in development, some of which are equally as unusual or new. There are DNA vaccines, which are different than RNA. They're both types of genetic material, but they are different. You'll notice there's like one strand here, whereas DNA is like this classic double helix there. There's viral vectors, where you take a weakened form of one type of virus that should not cause you disease and insert the information or the genetic information from the virus that you're trying to get your immune system to recognize into that, and use that to deliver it to the cell. Because people probably don't realize this, that's partly how viruses work. That really is how viruses work. Viruses already go into your cells, and they already take over your machinery for like making proteins, and it uses your body to involuntarily make copies of itself, which is different from a bacteria. That these are the three that are more I think they tend to make people more uncomfortable, and these are some of the ones that appear to be farther along in development. Then you have vaccines that are more typical, and some of the vaccines that are in development in different parts of the country are also using some of the older techniques. So virus-like particle, so something that is very similar to a part of the virus that your immune system should recognize. A protein subunits, again, they're like trying to take different parts of the virus so that your body can recognize it and create an immune response without you having had to have the actual natural infection. And then an inactivated virus, and that would be if someone were to, kill, like most flu vaccines, they're killed virus. The actual virus was allowed to multiply in typically like egg cells, and then you kill it and then inject that so that your immune system can recognize the different proteins. So I did want to give an overview just so people understand there's more than one type of vaccine that is being worked on, but these are the ones that we're talking about right now, these first two that have started being injected here in this country, the RNA vaccines. So just to give an overview of that, if we're going to move on to the next slide, the way those work is really, it's pretty, the science is interesting. I mean, if you're like the nerd type, regardless of whether or not you want to take the vaccine or not take it, it's fascinating. The technology is fascinating, where it's synthetic, so I've heard different things where, oh, it's fetal tissue or whatever. This vaccine, I don't know about the other ones. This vaccine it's not that. It's manufactured. It's like chemical engineered, basically. And they manufacture the RNA strands, they synthesize them, the part of the protein that, the part of the genetic code that will instruct your cells to make copies of the protein, that, like the little spike protein. So they put that in like a little fat bubble, because the fat bubble can fuse with your cell membrane and get inside of the cell. And then you have these little, you could think of it as like a printer. So you could think of this as like the flash drive, and this is like the printer, where it will print out copies of the protein, print out copies of the spike protein. And then when your immune system, if your cells start putting on coronavirus costumes, then your immune system is going to recognize it, like, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't belong here. And then, you get a reaction, and that's how it works, so that your body can make antibodies to this spike protein. And if it comes in contact with the natural infection, then it will, go on attack mode more efficiently, hopefully before copies of the virus are made, and it's allowed to multiply in your cells in a natural way. So that is how it works. So, I've heard things about how it's, and honestly, I'm going to be honest, I was like, hold up, I don't need anything doing any kind of RNAs and DNAs. Like, wait a minute, I had to go back to my biology books. Like, wait a minute, that's a little too funky for me. No, thank you. I don't want to be a GMO. But in this case, it doesn't go in your nucleus of your cell. It does not go to your DNA. It doesn't change your DNA. Whether or not they put something else in it that does completely something different, I suppose that can happen with anything. I mean, that can happen with anything. I like to make that very clear. Anything is possible. People have done horrible things before, and they could do horrible things again. But according to what we know about this, that's not how this works.
So one of the things that I want to emphasize is how long have you been practicing medicine?
2021 will be 19 years.
So for those who are listening, kind of tuning in, almost 20 years of medical practice and, like 7-8 years of training has contributed to Dr. Shabaz's like fund of knowledge to be able to then sort of see this image, break it down, and say what it does and does not do. And the reason that I want to lift that up is because when you have somebody, say your cousin Earl on Facebook, who's telling you, well, don't take the vaccine because it's going to give you a hairy back and it's going to do all. Your cousin Earl has not had 28 years of training and practice in medicine.
Right. If you don't want to take it because you don't trust it, that's different. But don't say that it's something that is not.
Right. And I think this is where, if anyone sort of kind of got lost in the middle of how you were explaining those two slides, what I want to say is take that to a trusted medical professional or someone who is in the healthcare profession that can, hopefully walk you through, or, if you have someone perhaps who's taken the vaccine, who's been a part of a trial, again, there's a lot of unknown, but there's also information that is clear about almost like the technology of how this vaccine has been produced.
And some pretty good YouTube videos too. Like I've seen some good YouTube videos with animation and all of that, that can be found on the internet.
Okay. So we'll post some of those links for people to check out. But what I want to emphasize is that I want people to do their homework. Right? Again, what we're saying is the skepticism, the fear, the concern, the confusion is very real. And there is information that we have to seek out. We have to do our due diligence. We have to, go to those in our communities who are trusted sources of information. And I'll say this, and maybe it'll ruffle a few feathers, but your pastor is not a medical professional. right? We may go to, our spiritual leaders, our imams, pastors, to, offer some spiritual guidance, to maybe offer a word that can help, soothe some of the fears or anxieties that we have. But that person should be telling you to go to your doctor or communicate with someone who has the requisite knowledge to help walk you through what is or might feel overwhelming. But they do not have the capacity, unless they have both an MD and an MDiv, they should not be offering that kind of advice. And so, Sophia, it looked like you wanted to say something.
Right. People can offer. People do offer if it's spiritual advice or like or a warning, because we got a warning from the Honorable Minister Farrakhan: don't take the vaccine until we'll have our own scientists evaluated. This is part of the reason why I know a lot about it, is because I'm reading a lot of information about it, to make sure that, wait a minute, we don't, just because they said on, CNN, Black people need to take this, and, we need to focus on Black people, which I think is harmful, because it adds to like just the anxiety about it. And I think that separating those two things, like, that's different from the science of what it is. Like, if it's that you don't take vaccines because you want to make sure that you couldn't be, harmed in some covert way, then that's advice that I think is appropriate for a spiritual leader to give. But I think that giving scientific information, you had to be very careful with that, because it's easy to get it wrong. Like, I have a chemical engineering degree. I did a concentration in biotechnology. I did genetic engineering labs and experiments, and it's still not like, oh yeah, you could just pick this up, It's not like that. Like, you need to know what you're talking about.
Absolutely. So I think for those who, again, are feeling some degree of legitimate caution and valid caution, it's, again, being able to identify those that you trust to offer, even clarification. You're like, this picture looks like Greek to me. And so can you explain this? Can you break this down for me? And if your spiritual leader is telling you, hold on, trust, let's talk to the scientists in our community. Let's talk to the medical professionals. That is appropriate and absolutely incredible advice, right? And it's acknowledging, like, this is my area of expertise. And we want to consult with those who have, again, the expertise, the training, the background to be able to provide guidance. And so I want to sort of round out this segment of kind of the overview by pulling Marguerite Hill up to kind of tie these two pieces together of, understanding the history of scientific racism and medical abuse, understanding, again, that there is accurate information that we can seek out. And we want to do it within the context of understanding that white supremacy and anti-Black racism, has influenced the way that we view the world and the way that the world impacts us. And so when we have a racial justice, anti-racist lens, then again, the gaslighting is unacceptable, right? We know why there's I don't even see paranoia, I think legitimate concern. And so when we apply this racial lens to our scientific knowledge, to the accurate information, then we can be more empowered. So I want to pull Marguerite Hill, who's the executive director of the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, to talk a little bit more about that lens.
It's like, it's been truly informative, just listening to you all speak on the history of medical racism, on the response, and knowing more about the nature of the vaccine and, and the disease, like how it's impacting you as a medical practitioner and the community that you serve. Yeah, just I definitely, I mean, and there's even things to follow up in my own family's history with the medical experimentation. So I hope to follow up offline, because that trauma is real, and there was actually like a county in Georgia. So, and I just I wanted to know the date that you talked about, Aya, when they were doing, you know, some of that work of saying that they're going to pay for burials. So, um, a lot to process. It is a very heavy topic, right? Uh, Gosh, so just the 14 million people who've been infected with COVID, and we know like some people have it mild, other people are suffering from cognitive issues, right? From the disease, like from the recovery is long. Like I've known people who, when they first, like after they recovered, they couldn't like jog for like 1 minute without just losing their breath, and now they're still trying to build that up, and they're getting, like they're trying to get screenings to see what is the impact on their hearts and on their lungs. So there's a lot that we don't know fully about COVID-19. And then with the 200, like, I mean, the last number that I had as of Thursday was 276, over 276,000. I know that number is climbing, and it's especially climbing in like these dense urban areas. And then there's another strain in the UK. So I'm thinking about these issues globally. So I'll try to like bring in some of those themes. What I really wanted to focus on this evening was to talk about the importance of having a race equity framework as we think about the vaccine, and like who gets it, who has access, and to think about like how we can begin to imagine, who do we center in care. So as I began to do some research on the vaccine itself, because I looked at a lot of the policy demands for COVID, just looked like across the country early on during the pandemic, and and early on, like communities like Black Lives Matter LA, when they had their policy demands, they did talk about equity and the importance that we adopt that equity lens. And in fact, we've seen a major shift in our nation of talking of understanding systemic racism and lack of access to healthcare. Now, the Center for Disease Control has, they, like, if you look on their website, like they talk about race equity. 19 states talk about the disadvantage index. And so like, what do we mean for that? A lot of those are placemakers, because like, like there's some ethics around, of creating some type of system to address the disparities, right? Like to address the fact that Black people especially have been so hit hard with COVID, but they can't necessarily say like, okay, Black people first in line. Well, two aspects. One, we're not guinea pigs, right? Like, so it just feeds into that, the concerns that, okay, put Black people first in line. And if there's any negative outcomes, even if we don't know immediately, because we've seen, like case after case, or like when you've seen different medicines come in, and birth defects, or things that we don't know. So just putting us first in line isn't going to solve the racial disparity. But at the same time, if we're last in line, just given the historical distrust, and less the likelihood, right? There's not just distrust that makes vaccines, or immunizations to flus, to things that could actually prevent from death from yearly illnesses, or other things. Like so we have to really address that. So one of the things I started, like, of looking at the numbers, that even for like the influenza vaccination rate, based on race, that that Black people are about 39% likely to get, compared to 49% of white Americans. So Black people are 39% likely to get an influenza vaccine. The Latinx community, 37% are likely to get it. Asian Americans, 44%. And American Indian, Alaska Natives, 38%. so we're seeing this kind of the disparities as far as like who's getting vaccinated for things. But when you look at the statistics, right, I mean, we're pretty low, like as far as people that really trust the COVID vaccine. So like in general, like less than 4 out of 10 Black, Latinx, and Native Americans are vaccinated in general, you know, like for like their vaccination rates compared to about 70% across racial groups. So it's like, so what is that about? Is that just fear? Like, no, it's both the distrust, but it's access. Many Black folks live in healthcare deserts, right, where it's not easily like where they can access that. So there's barriers to vaccination. A lot of this has to do with being uninsured, right? So these are things that we have to really think about, and what causes some concern even as we have the Supreme Court. And this is why we really have to work to build power to change like how healthcare is happening in this country. So uninsured rates across the country, white Americans, like according to this, and I could look at the studies like KFF. I'll get that, like it's so tiny, and my actually like my vision is going out. I'm gonna need some glasses shortly. But 7.8% of white Americans are uninsured, 11.4% of Black Americans are uninsured. 20% of Latinx community are uninsured, compared to 7.2% of Asian Americans. And then for Native American, Alaskan Natives, 21.7% are uninsured, and Pacific Islanders, 12.7%. So that's like very stark. Like when you start to think about like who's not likely to be uninsured to be able to access good health care, and then when they're impacted, like if they contract COVID, what happens with those medical bills, right? What happens for them even to likely get the vaccine? And then if they're unvaccinated, like, you know, like what is the, you know, like there's going to be a domino effect on their lives. Like when you can't work and you're already, you know, like we have like those gaps in wealth and jobs that don't provide those benefits, and we're seeing people lose their jobs or being forced to actually go to work even when they are sick because they don't have you know, they don't have good benefits. So that uninsured rate, like this is something we have to address during this time. So, you know, the likelihood of negative healthcare experiences. So many Black folks feel that they've been lied to by health practitioners. So having the culturally competent healthcare workers is absolutely important. Being refused to order a test or treatment that they thought that they were needed. So Black folks at 19% in this study. And, you know, like that's pretty significant compared to 12% of Latinx and 12% of whites. So like Black folks are more likely to say like, I wanted a test and I didn't get it. So those are things I think we should really kind of consider, is like the general experience, the disparities, the lack of access to care, and you know, across the country, states and public health agencies, they're recognizing these complex things. And it's important for us to be aware of that. One, not just because we're recipients of that, but we have to hold them accountable. And I'll talk a little bit about why it's going to be absolutely important that especially predominantly white institutions, state agencies and everything focus on the repairing the harm, acknowledging the harm, and doing harm, like repairing, mitigating the harm, you know, that they've done, compensating victims, right? And then issuing public apologies and demonstrating their commitments to build back trust, because it's going to take many years for us to really recover from COVID, right? And for us to all, like for us to be safe and recover, like we all have to be safe. So there are different indexes that these state institutions are using. Like we know some of these algorithms, like I'm sure many of you saw what happened at Stanford, where they had the first people that got the shots and none of them were frontline people. Like there were people that were like remote, right? None of the residents who were doing the work. So there was this big protest, and the residents were saying like, look, we are protesting on not just on behalf of us as residents, but the people who are doing services, providing services to patients. And this is something that's also important as we think about the rollout, because now we're seeing that wealthy people, they're, you know, they can go to these boutique shops and get, you know, jump ahead of the line of healthcare workers so that they could be in, because they were getting the tests early on. I'm sure you saw that they were getting tested when many of us, like people who are sick, people I knew who had all of the symptoms of COVID and could not access a test, but yet the Kardashians could. So it's just like, and they were like, fine. So, you know, so those things of thinking about who has access, how can wealthy people jump the line and get access, but meantime, essential workers, and how are essential workers defined? Because like, you know, like they're right now focusing on medical professionals, but I mean, I know, like, I mean, within my own family business where they do cleaning services. So my nephew who works with workers who are doing industrial cleanup, right? And in properties, he was actually exposed to COVID, you know? And so it's like, was he an essential worker, even though like he has to work to clean up properties, to clean up industrial properties? There are people, like all sorts of staff that work in hospitals, right? That are cleaning the beds, that are mopping the floors, right? That are intaking the patients. Like, how do we ensure that everyone that's working in that environment that is exposed to COVID, that has to take the bus because they can't afford to get in the car? So like those likelihoods that they would be exposed on public transportation, get vaccinated. So those are questions and things that they're trying to work out on, you know, on state level, local agencies. But if we do not have public education on that, and we're not aware of those like the indexes that they're looking at to roll out and to prioritize certain communities, like for right now, it's like healthcare workers, then it's like for people in long-term care, especially the elderly. And, you know, and then how do we think about the phases of this so that we can ensure those who are most vulnerable, the unhoused, right? The people who have to take public transportation, the people who live in dense urban cities, those are factors that they're thinking about for the disadvantaged, but then we don't know how, if we're not aware, we're not going to be able to hold them accountable. So finally, I would take that to the kind of global level, because I see a lot of Americans, there's a lot of my peoples, like they're talking about they're hopping on flights, right? And as we think about like international, they're going on vacation. And my concern is like a lot of places that when Americans, when we go on vacation and we may be carrying COVID, right? We may be in like, okay, maybe we have be immunized, but places where they didn't have outbreaks. But if you look, there's a map that shows the rollout and the dates when it's going to hit, likely to hit countries, right? And the rich countries are first, and then like developing nations, the global south, are last. And we have to really, as Americans, as we think about global white supremacy, right? As we think about our people in diaspora, we have to also really make sure that we do not have, you know, very similar to the AIDS crisis, where people are not getting the care that they need. And we'd see this pandemic start to sweep across the motherland. So that's something that I think we really need to be aware of. And the more that we understand from a race equity lens, the complex factors that can make our communities vulnerable, then the more that we can hold the medical system, our government system, and our communities accountable to do the right thing.
Thank you so much, Marguerite. If I may, you know, one of the things that I want to emphasize and underscore from what you said is, you know, we have to also have the accurate historical knowledge that, you know, some of which Professor Noureddin was able to provide, the information about the disease and the vaccine itself. And then also this race equity lens, which says, you know, there's going to be a lot of thinking that we have to do about even the strategic way that we protect ourselves and our community members, because we may all be connected to someone who is not sort of formally designated an essential worker, but has great exposure. And so we want to also make sure that they have the accurate information that they need, and that as Americans, we're, very cognizant of how we might perpetuate harm against others, not thinking about kind of our connection, in the diaspora. So I want us to take a deep breath. A lot of information. We're getting towards sort of the final few minutes, and we have some questions that we want to answer. This 90 minutes will not answer all of our questions. And so really our emphasis on seek the knowledge that you need in order to make an informed decision, right? And seek that knowledge from those who have the expertise, right? Dr. Shabazz says, I've been practicing for almost 20 years. I have a background in genetic engineering and biochemical engineering, and I'm a physician. And so if I'm going to ask someone, well, tell me what I need to know, I'm going to go to someone like Dr. Shabazz who can break this down for me. And so, having that historical, that racial equity lens, and also accurate information empowers us so that we can ask questions. No one is saying, just say, oh, because, CNN told me that I should take it. We're not advocating that, right? Make informed decisions because we have a history that we're trying to reconcile. However, we cannot bury our heads in the sand because we've lost 50,000 community members. Across the country, 314,000, and they're projecting that by potentially April 2021, 560,000 Americans would have died of COVID. And so we want to be mindful of that. So I'm going to stop share of my screen so we can get to, again, some of your questions. I'll try to, kind of condense some of the ones that, are related to, if you've submitted in the Q&A, I'm going to go to that first. So we have a question about, one, I think this is one I've heard a lot of people asking, is like, how was it able to be the vaccine produced so quickly, right? So that is sort of sometimes a red flag for those who are unaware of the technology and the production. How could they roll this out in such a short period of time? Dr. Sophia, if you could answer that question.
Two things. One is that there was already, people were have already been working on things like this. And the other thing is, a lot of the problems that they had were problems that with enough money thrown at it, then they could do it. Or maybe they already had it. What I'm understanding and learning, like we're all learning about at least the mRNA technology, is that, and maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, it's pretty easy to synthesize RNA. So you can make RNA for a whole bunch of different types of things. And, that could be a good thing or that could be a bad thing. But I think that the perception that it did not exist before is just not, it's not really true. People weren't aware of it. They weren't working on it, but it has existed before it was made into the commercial product.
So a related question is, does the vaccine prevent us from getting COVID? And I'm not sure if you can answer this, but
based on the studies, yes. I mean, did they lie? Did they say something fake? They would have had to, if they're not lying and made the whole thing up, which I don't think is quite like that, then yes, it protects the person who got it. What they have not really consistently shown is that it could keep you from spreading it to other people. So that part they didn't even really look at in the Pfizer study. And they just released the Moderna information last Tuesday, and I haven't completely worked through it, but I understand there was some type of way they evaluated it. But I can say with more clarity that it does protect the person who got the vaccine.
Okay. And so
at least for the short amount of time, because for the short amount of time that they have studied them.
So a related question from the same person is, and I'll very quickly kind of answer this, but then, you know, as a physician, I want you to offer your perspective as well. The question was, are we promoting that the Black community should accept the vaccine? And I'll just say very quickly, very concisely, what we're advocating is that you make an informed decision.
Right. I don't think I would ever be someone that's like promoting something like that. I think that it kind of conflicts with just my religious sub-community. So I probably wouldn't be on that soapbox. That's not my soapbox. But at the same time, like if I'm having a conversation with an individual, you know, just trying to work through, I know that, yeah, people die of COVID. Like, I'm not going to act like this is the same as other things. It's not. You know, like I told you, I've been a physician for 19 years. I've never diagnosed somebody with measles. I personally usually don't even like talking about vaccines because I feel like it's too much emotion on both sides. I have patients that get them. I have patients that don't get them. Neither of them have dropped dead in the floor. So I personally don't even like getting into that, you know, debate with people, but this is different. This is different because people are dying. People are not dying and being debilitated. So like, I can't act like it's the same as everything else. It's not. Okay. So, you know, then, you know, I feel like people are going to have to make some calculations for themselves. Like, all right, you know, if you're concerned, could this do something to the reproductive system? Then you have to ask yourself, you know, at 60 years old, are you planning to have more children? I mean,
so there was a question, and I want to pull Professor Noureddin around, because I think you mentioned this and sort of how medical professionals are, not everyone is fortunate enough to have a Black doctor, right, of someone who's culturally competent. So this question was, how can white or non-Black people of color or providers respond to Black patients who express concern about the vaccine being potentially harmful or perhaps not having enough knowledge? So what would you advise those providers?
So what I would advise is a few things. I would advise for people who are white physicians or who are not Black and they have Black patients to read up on this history. There's lots of resources available online about the history of racism in medicine. I'm gonna post a link to a resource in the chat for folks that I helped put together with some other historians of medicine that are also Black about this history. That's a great place to start. I would also recommend that if you're in a sort of encounter with a patient who's expressing these concerns, listen to them and take them seriously. Do not dismiss them, do not mock them, do not minimize them, because they come from a place of history and a place of cultural memory, right? And what your role in a clinical setting is to provide information to that person so that they can make an informed decision, not to berate them for not having information that they need to have, and point them to reputable sources, point them to, there's people are putting a lot of, like the field of sort of science communication broadly is getting a lot better. So there are resources, people are making, there's really incredible like virologists and immunologists making really informative like YouTube videos and posting things on Twitter and Snapchat that are doing huge efforts for just making, you know, scientific information more legible to people who don't have a background in these areas. So I would say that's what.
I just want to interject one point is that after, for those who are listening, for after the webinar, I'm going to ask Professor Noureddin and also Dr. Shabazz and Sister Hill to post those links because people are asking, well, what if I don't have a Black physician? What if I don't know where to start with the information? So that is one of the reasons that we formed the coalition, is to be able to provide a hub of resources and links for those who really just want a starting place of reputable, sort of trusted experts who are providing this information. I want to go to another question. And I think it's related to what you're saying about how providers can begin to interact with community members. The question is, how do we balance in our messaging specifically, both the necessary patience and compassion for the real trauma here, and the urgency or sense of immediacy of needing to test and vaccinate a significant portion of the population? So what strategies can public health departments use to foster trust And then there's sort of like foster trust quickly, which I'll reserve comment, because this is like centuries, right, of history, and it will not be undone in a week. And so just if all of you, I think, can offer even like a 30-second kind of suggestion for ways to begin the process of building trust. So I'm going to go with you, Professor Noordine, and then I'm going to go around my screen.
I would say the quickest answer, like if you're looking for there's no quick and easy way to restore, centuries of structural inequality. You're not going to be able to flip a switch and have that, we're not Thanos. We can't just do that. But what we have to, I think what you have to do is first listen to Black people, listen to our concerns, listen to what we're telling you. If people are saying, I don't want this for X reason, listen to that and take it seriously and take the responsibility of educating yourself in a clinical setting to answer those questions and allay those fears as much as you can. There are, like I was saying before, and I can post more of this, towards the end, but there are Black physicians who are writing about this. One of the key folks who was instrumental in developing the vaccine is Dr. Kizamika Corbett, who is a Black woman at NIH, right? Like that there are people who are public facing that are writing about this stuff. There are Black bioethicists who have been writing about medical mistrust for 2 and 3 decades, right? And now, they've been writing about this and they haven't gotten as far. It's been a sort of internal conversation because there are a lot of white people who were not interested in those concerns. Now that they are interested, they should turn to what Black people have been saying and doing all along.
Thank you. And Dr. Shabazz?
How to make, just to restate, how to make
so
Black
maybe
people trust.
No. So I'll rephrase it. A first initial step in repairing the harm, right? Given the fact that we are in somewhat of an urgent kind of moment, right? And so from your perspective as a physician, I'm sure you have patients who've come to you that have had experiences that are very negative. The first attempts at kind of repairing the harm so that they can be receptive to the information that you can provide.
Well, I try to just be a realist with people about their individual situation and, the choices laid out in front of them and what the implications are to them. I think that, one of the difficult things is when you have like a whole mountain of maybes, but then that's stacked up against the definite and trying to balance that because, I deal with this. I've had several patients who have died, what I would say prematurely, from cancer because they were so mistrustful of the cancer treatment that they took their chances with the cancer. And maybe they didn't see it that way, but, they had more faith in, a bunch of other things that are, alternative or natural or whatever. And I'm Black, I'm a Muslim, nothing I could say could convince them that that was a bad choice. So I think it's really just making sure that you acknowledge people's concerns. I think representation it's really important, but I think when we have the history, like Dr. or soon to be Dr. Noordine is explaining about how we have been involved. I mean, I don't know how many of the nurses were fully aware of exactly what was going on. Maybe they were aware, maybe they were not. We can't just say, well, I'm Black, you should trust me, because that doesn't fly either. I think one of the things that would be most harmful is forcing people. That is something that I'm personally against, people being forced to do things. And I think if you want mistrust to fly through the roof, then force people to do something.
Yeah. And again, having that racial equity lens, right, around the reparation of harm, of why this skepticism, this mistrust has really just flowered over time, kind of given the repeated abuses. And so, Margie, what would you offer for those institutions, you said in sort of your remarks that institutions need to be able to begin this process. So in your estimation, where should it begin, knowing that it's not going to be a quick fix?
Yeah, I mean, as far as like for medical care, right? Like whether that's in, where there's large concentrations of Black communities, or where there's not, like, I mean, there's some cities, so in different states like Georgia, where there's not a medical center there. And so even like they don't even have the facilities to store the vaccine to give to the people, right? So it's like, as far as like the state, it's incumbent upon the state to like get the facilities there so that people can get treatment, like, so, and that we have to really make that demand. And that's why even, as we're looking at the elections in Georgia, or in whether it's like in the rural, like in rural areas, the rural South, or in our urban areas, like, so I mean, as far as institutions that may have, have perpetuated harm, right? Whether, like I do think having town halls, and they're just going to have to take some of that heat. They're going to have to take people airing that out, right? Like to say like, look, I went in, I didn't get the test that I needed. I didn't get the top care, and how do I get care? Like there were people, so many people died because they were told to go back home and just sweat it out in their room, and they didn't get treatment. And that's why they are now amongst our ancestors. So it's just like, and I think that they have to say, okay, like we've made mistakes, and they have to say like, and we're going to take these steps, like, look, and like, and if things do go wrong, and to ensure that we still we will work to rectify that. Like if there's medical malpractice, if there's negative outcomes, then everybody in this country has to be ready to support those who have been harmed by whatever the treatments. And I think that's also important for like, if we know like, well, what if I do get sick getting the vaccine? Because I know people
that's
have
missing from the
reactions.
conversation. It's a medication. Medications have adverse events. To act like it's not going to happen is just like,
and and if they don't have like, okay, well, we'll do this to support you if you have the allergic reaction, if somehow like your body just goes into like overdrive, we got you. And so, and some of that we will have to be radical and stuff. But I mean, and I think that's where I think some of the smaller healthcare, the health centers, like there's places like, I don't know, like what role like Clinic, or some of, like some of the Muslim centers that are developing, like how we could work in partnership with them. It's like, okay, if whoever's disseminating the vaccine, there could be other ways that we care for the people who are getting it. I do think that we need to have more discussions like this, where people can get, some their questions answered. And, like, yeah, like we can't really force the vaccine on anybody, right? It's but we're trying to work to build more public trust so that we can get the healthcare that we need, that we're asking for, and that we can get enough people vaccinated so that we can get back to normal. I want my daughter to go to school. She hasn't played with kids, and like, I mean, this has been 7 months, she hasn't played with another child. So our lives have been so disrupted through this. And I think that we will have to have like really hard conversations, and then we have to work to train our people, right, for the critical thinking to understand these issues. And that means like we may hold those contradictions, because I think a lot of people, we're trying to solve some contradictions here, but we can hold both of those things, be like, I don't trust you, but I need your medicine. So like, how can I make sure like you can hold those two things?
Yes.
And that's let us like hold those tensions and try to get the best care that we can for our people.
Absolutely. The last question, and I know we're going to have to wrap up, and I think sort of this question kind of illustrates, I think, the difficulty folks might have in even hearing about the reticence that many Black Americans have. So the question is, by not advocating for the vaccine, are we not widening the healthcare disparities as more African Americans will die from COVID? Very quickly, what I'll say is we're not dying from COVID, right, at this disproportionate rate because we're reticent. We're dying of COVID at this rate because of the many centuries of oppression, of white supremacy, of systemic racism. And so when folks make Black Americans sort of the identified patient, like the problem resides within us, that is sort of faulty logic, right? And so when we begin to understand the concerns that are raised, people have to listen and sit with their discomfort. We've been sitting with discomfort for many centuries, and pain. And so when people are expressing it, right, I think there has to be some humility in being able to sit with what people need to express in order to even be receptive to information that might be coming from someone who looks like an oppressor, right? And so even in making that attempt to say, you know what, this isn't sitting well with me, but like, I want my daughter to go to school, right? I want to be able to hug my father. I want to, you know, I think that it really begins with people understanding that the paranoia doesn't sort of reside within us. It is just a manifestation of the treatment that has occurred. And so I do want to, I don't know if there's like a,
can I add something to that? Because, you know, the fact is, part of the, well, really probably the reason why there is such a disparity is that our health was already bad. Mm-hmm. And many people feel that if all of the warp speed money was put into making our health better, there would not be such a disparity. And, you know, I think another thing that kind of bugs me is that there is disproportion in terms of the number of negative effects that have occurred because of COVID in Black people. But you just said that 50,000 died, but the number is over 300,000. We are not the cause of this pandemic. Right. We're not the, and I feel like some of the hyper focus, I feel like it's overdone and it adds to mistrust, and it's a hyper focus on the is it 12% of the population? Yes. Why don't you worry about yourself? So I feel like that creates some tension there where it's like, okay, you weren't concerned about my diabetes and cancer and kidney failure, and now all of a sudden, you know, it's my fault. Right. I'm going to keep the pandemic going because and I feel like that needs to be cut off right at the door.
Well, when we have sort of armed militia that are going to the Michigan, state capitol to say, I refuse to wear a mask. Well, I think we do need to talk about the 65 to 70% of individuals who are not being compliant with CDC recommendations. And so the disproportionate impact on us, again, is a manifestation of what is systemically wrong, right, in this country with the healthcare system and every other system that we're engaged in. And so I think, I agree with you that this hyper focus on, well, why aren't Black folks taking this vaccination? It's like, let's talk about Idaho. Let's talk about North Dakota. Let's talk about Arizona, right? And so I think for us, it's making sure that our people have accurate information. And I'll say again, affirming that the concerns and the fears are legitimate, right? And no one should be allowed to kind of gaslight you into believing that you're being irrational. Now, these conspiracy theories about getting superpowers on December 21st, I'm not God. I'm just going to take a guess here and say, I don't know what kind of superpower you want, Marguerite.
I wouldn't be mad, but I feel like that's a little less than likely. Now, I'm not going to be angry if I can shoot lasers out of my eyes or something, but
So that I think is on us, like as sort of like community accountability, for those who are spreading misinformation, to kind of sit them down and say, hey, this is going to be counterproductive. We're not trying to change your views. They are what they are. but spreading them can actually endanger those that you love. So maybe think twice about that.
Can I just add one thing really quick
Sure,
to that? I think another conversation we need to be having also as a community, especially regarding, you know, things that are various, all of us have a cousin Earl, right? Is that we also, because of all of these other forms of inequality that are exacerbated by COVID and exacerbated by lots of other things, we also have a problem, I think, in the community with a lack of information literacy.
Can you say a little bit about what you mean by that?
Sure. So I am a librarian also, in addition to doing the history of horrifying things. And one of the things that I think it drives the misinformation and drives the sort of the kinds of conversations that we're kind of trying to reckon with now is that we don't often have the skills to evaluate what is a credible piece of information and what is not. And I think that, especially regarding scientific and medical information, is a really, really big issue, because sometimes people will, you know, will find something on a blog, on a YouTube video, and will be like, that sounds about right. But because we're lacking the sort of skills or abilities and knowledges because of other kinds of inequality to say, wait a minute, this is fishy. Wait a minute, this is a troll. Wait a minute, this is, you know, wrong information. Because we're not differentiating between something that's like in a peer-reviewed journal and something that's just like your cousin Earl, right? And like those kinds of
anybody named
information
Earl,
have different
we're
kinds
not
of
trying to drag
value,
you.
but they're not the same.
Right.
Right? Like one can be like, they can do different kinds of work for you and have different kinds of value and mean different things. But something that comes out in the New England Journal of Medicine is not the same as a YouTube video that's like the secret untold truth behind whatever. These are not the same, and you shouldn't treat them the same.
Right.
But because of other kinds of deficits, especially in things like education, in access to computers and internet and all of these other things, this is also a gap that I think we as a community need to talk about.
Yes. And so what I wanted to just post here, again, we're not advocating that people take it, right? What we're advocating for is that you make an informed decision. I hope, you know, at the risk of repeating myself, we want you to make an informed decision, and also to be cognizant of the sort of the outcomes or the consequences of the decisions that you make, not only on yourself and your family, but those that you are connected to. And so if after getting this information, talking to your physician and other healthcare professionals, you decide that you will not take the vaccine. Okay. As long as you are also cognizant of what are the potential repercussions of that decision, right? And so no one should be forced. I agree with Dr. Shabazz, but we want to make sure that the literacy is there, the information is there. This woman, her name is Lily Tyson. She is the daughter of Freddie Tyson, who was a participant in the Tuskegee study. What she said was that she's going to take the vaccine, but she absolutely understands the distrust. This is a picture of her father. And what she said was, I want people of color to be able to look at situations, especially when it comes to protecting their health, and do their due diligence in finding out the necessary information so that they make the right decisions and not be afraid. We have to step forward and not be afraid to make our lives better. And so, you know, Ms. Lily Tyson, I think, has given us the advice, like sage advice from her own personal family experience that I think we absolutely need to consider. And so as long as, you know, as Muslims also, and those of faith, of other faiths, also kind of praying about it, right? That if there are major decisions that you make in your life, and this I would consider a major decision, that you think about getting medical information, you want spiritual guidance, you know, from someone that you trust who will say, yes, I think this is a good idea for you to consult with an expert, a trusted expert. And then at the end of the day, being able to have sort of a family meeting, right? To say, what are going to be our steps forward? And so those, I pulled this from what Dr. Shabazz is also offering. And I'll just say that, you know, I love Dr. Shabazz's way of sort of providing information to folks. She pulls no punches. And so, you know, what she advised was, if you're so focused on a choice you'll be faced with next spring, right? And maybe, you know, once the vaccine rolls out to the general public in 2021, don't be so focused on a choice you'll be faced with next spring. that you overlook what you must do to survive the next 2 months. And so if you're saying, well, you know, people are pushing the vaccine, but you don't wear a mask, you don't social distance, you don't do those things that have proven to reduce your risk, I think the order of priorities needs to be evaluated. Okay.
Or you don't do what you can to try to reduce the risk factors that you can control that make you more susceptible. I think that's important. That's important. And there are a couple of other things that I did want to make sure that I mentioned could possibly be helpful, you know, because in my patients, I think one of the things that has helped is trying to replete people's vitamin D level. I know that that is a pervasive problem in our community that I have seen, and it's something that could suppress the amount of suffering. You know, I don't know on a population-wide level what that will look like, but from everything I've read, that is something that could help also to suppress the death that we're seeing from it.
Okay. So just to, you know, thank you all for those who are still on and listening. We'll make the slides available and the recording. But just to summarize, acknowledge your skepticism and concern is valid. Seek out sign nasiha, that's, you know, what we say, like consultation or guidance. So consulting with a physician or a trusted healthcare professional. If you don't know someone that you can consult with directly, these are the resources that we're going to be providing through the coalition, whether it's links to sort of reputable explanations on YouTube or articles that you can read yourself. You know, we will provide that. Debunking the myths and the misinformation. Again, I think to Professor Nuruddin's point, is like learning how to discern what is accurate and what is just full of conjecture and assumption and, you know, misinformation. And because the vaccine is not available to the general public, adhere to the CDC guidelines. Wearing your mask under your nose is not proper mask wearing. And so there are things that, that we can do to sort of improve our sense of our own efficacy. And so have you made changes in your health, in your diet, the decisions you make about who you congregate with? Those are things that are within our control, and we must do the best we can in order to reduce our risk to the best of our ability. And so this last point is understand your risk of exposure. During the summer, it was easy to sort of like do social distance outside. It is now winter, at least on the East Coast. And so when we're thinking about Christmas coming up for some people, New Year's, we're seeing a bump in the number of cases because of Thanksgiving, people not adhering to those recommendations. And so we're now faced with another major holiday and two major holidays with Christmas and New Year's. And so people have decisions to make. And so traveling outside of the state, meeting with people, I think we really, really have to consider if we're doing everything we can in order to reduce the risk and potentially, you know, what we're doing to spread the disease, knowing how contagious it can be. If I'm going to provide just information about the Black Muslim COVID Coalition, you can, you know, check us out on online on social media. And this is information about all of us here. So tweet at us, maybe not inundate with emails, but if there is a question, we'll try to get through all the questions that were submitted that weren't answered. But we'll definitely say, you know, consult, read, be more discerning, those things that are within your control to mitigate, do so to the very best of your ability. And in our final few seconds, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask each of you if sort of in, you know, your 1 minute elevator pitch, what would you advise or sort of as takeaways for those who are still with us? So I'll start with you, Professor Nuruddin.
Thanks. So I guess to get back on my soapbox here, I think understanding and knowing the history helps you to make good decisions about what's going on in the present. I'm always going to be like reading. Knowledge is power. I know I sound like an after school special. And I think that's important. I'm going to post a couple more links in the chat, but being aware that Black people have been talking about a lot of these things that we've been bringing up for a long time. We didn't just start having this conversation about the impact of medical mistrust on healthcare. This has been a conversation for at least the last 2 or 3 decades. And so paying attention to that. I will also say, just personally, I do not speak for the Muslim Wellness Foundation or for any other entities, but I will say personally, as a Black woman who has experienced definitely medical issues, had negative encounters with physicians, have been ignored, I've had an allergic reaction to a vaccine, I am definitely planning to get the vaccine when it is made available to me. That is my personal decision based on the information that I have. Because I think it's important to share, because I want people to understand that there's more than one right answer to this question. But what's important is that you have the information to make the right decision, and you're not basing it on things that are not accurate and are not valid. There are, like I said, a lot of Black folks have put together resources. The Islamic Medical Association of North America also has put together a set of resources from an Islamic perspective as well. They've put together some statements that were done in consultation with physicians, scientists, as well as Islamic scholars. And I'm going to post a link to that in the chat as well. So there's people who are also thinking in these collaborative ways about these questions as well. And I would encourage folks to look at those resources.
Thank you. Dr. Shabazz?
Yes, I think that one of the most important, and I think really what has been the work of the Black Muslim COVID Coalition from the beginning is to provide people with credible information. And I think that dealing in actual facts is important. You know, people need actual facts. What people do, you know, when they go to their doctor or whatever healthcare decisions they make for themselves, I want people to make them based on actual facts. And I also want people to be in, you know, like triage mode in terms of like what their priorities or their concerns are. We can't act like this is not a major problem that is on our doorstep right now and do nothing about it. Because, you know, what I see is people, you know, they get so hyper focused on the vaccine that they are not focused on just survival. And I'm like, well, because you don't want the vaccine now, COVID doesn't exist, or it's not that big of a deal, or it's not that bad. Like, that is something that I find disturbing. I don't personally think that there's only one solution to the problem. And I think that, you know, it's tough trying to navigate those different roles. It's particularly tough for me because I'm in the nation. We are an anti-vaccine culture, and yet I'm trying to figure out how to navigate the fact that we have lots of people who have lots of health conditions who are very vulnerable. So, you know, it's not easy for anybody, but as long as we're dealing in reality, then we have a place to start.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. And last but not least, Sister Margaret.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, to close out, I mean, I think what we should focus on, right, is on the care and treatment of our community and equitable medical care, which would reduce those vulnerabilities. And that, inshallah, we can get to a certain point where we have enough herd immunity where for those who are choosing to not take the vaccine, where they could also be safe and protected. Like, I think that we can exist with those, you know, with the varieties of practice, but practicing with wearing a mask. Like, this is going to be a long journey, right, to getting our society back healthy and whole. And we need to be really committed and think about equity throughout the whole process.
So I guess the last thing that I would say, again, just to connect all of these points, is, you know, there is no right answer. So if someone was sort of coming to the webinar to say, okay, these experts are going to tell us what to do. No, that's, as a psychologist, I don't tell people what to do, right? You advise, right? You offer, you know, the information that you think is necessary to make an informed decision. And so for those who are still skeptical, you should be, right? I mean, there's so much that we're still trying to reconcile. But I want people to kind of bear in mind, and this is just one exercise that I really, really want people to do, is take out a piece of paper, draw a circle, and put yourself in the middle, right? Put your name in the middle of that circle in the center, and then draw lines and other circles to people that you are connected to. And so for me, that looks like, my 3 children. It looks like also being connected to, to their fathers, to their grandparents, to the daycare workers that, care for my son. So I could generate probably a list of 100 people that I'm connected to. And so the decision that I make for myself and my family will impact those 97 other individuals, right? And so I think as, for those who are living in sort of collectivist cultures that understand community well-being, it is an individual decision, but we also need to kind of think about our obligation to other believers, to other community members. And so what we decide to do for ourselves also, again, impact those who are in our lives voluntarily or involuntarily. And, being able to, again, sit with the repercussions of those decisions that we make. And so we'll post the information that we have. We'll offer suggestions. I would advise that people sit and think about, right? This is hard, right? It is not going to be resolved in a day, in a week, or in months. But what this pandemic is exposing is how vulnerable Black communities are. And on the level of information that we need, the advocacy that we need, I think to begin to really trust and listen to Black experts who have been advocating for equity and for, just equitable treatment. Listen to those voices and really seek out the information that will, again, for you, feel comfortable and you can sort of resolve that within your own life. So for those who are still here, thank you for submitting your questions, for your curiosity, for your presence. And I would just, hope that for everyone who is sort of understanding the gravity of the moment that we're in, just also being able to take that sort of sense of heaviness to the Creator, to have conversations and prayer, to ask for guidance from the one who is the source of all knowledge, as we kind of proceed with, understanding the next steps that we need to take for ourselves and for our family. So I want to thank for my guests, my scholars. It's always just, I think, beautiful to sit with Black Muslim scholars, especially, and for people to know that we do exist, right? Those who've had 20 years of medical training, who, specialized in the history of medicine, those who are always talking about advocacy and racial equity. This is the knowledge within our community that we need to understand, that we need to leverage, that we need to respect, and to, seek guidance from those who can provide that accurate information. So thank you all for joining. We'll post the information shortly. And I just wish, for those who are making those decisions, that God be with you, and that you are just, again, kind of taking the time that you need to reconcile within yourself this moment. So good night. Assalamu alaikum. And thanks for joining.